keynote speaker today is Mark Harbour, Senior Executive with Morgan Stanley, who has been, and this is in stunning contrast to our first speaker, but Mark has been in the financial and wealth advisory roles for a staggering 42 years. So a lot of experience for our next speaker in this industry. Mark noticed there's been a number of recent industry developments affecting how investors, professionals, and firms work with each other. So Mark's talk today is aptly named Your Investment Future, What to Expect and How to Plan for It. Mark's talk will include key highlights and observations from recent industry studies and surveys, and a discussion of their ramifications. Mark will address changes that may be appropriate for you to consider in your personal investment process in view of these changing trends. In the event that you engage with an industry professional, Mark will provide suggestions of whom to hire, for what, and how to evaluate what they do for you. A little bit about Mark. And Mark, I will be closing the door as soon as I finish this introduction because I'm getting the feedback from the hallway. A little bit about Mark. In addition to having amazing longevity in this field, Mark is a certified public accountant and also a chartered financial analyst. He is past president of the CFA Society of Los Angeles and current member of the U.S. Advocacy Advisory Council for the CFA Institute. Thank you. Mark is also ethics editor for the Investing and Wealth Monitor magazine. And now a personal factoid about Mark. Mark partners with his wife, Bernadette, for their financial advisory practice at Morgan Stanley. Mark is from Oklahoma. His wife is from Queens. So sometimes Mark's quips that not only do they have the typical husband and wife communication challenges, and this is often exasperated as Mark speaks Okie and his wife speaks Queensian. Accordingly, over the years, they've had to develop patience, empathy, and in their dialogue with one another. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Mark Harbour.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? The microphone all right?
Yes.
I'm actually going to split the talk into a couple of segments. One is the reference to the industry trends, what the studies are showing, and in the handouts, hopefully there were enough for everybody to get one if you wanted. There are some reading resources at the end that I would suggest that you take a peek at, and I'm going to call a couple of specific instances of those that I think are relevant to not only the investment industry, but sort of society as a whole in some ways, in connection with what we're seeing with technology and so forth. So, first, industry trends, and then talking about valuing advisory support and what that means and how to be most efficient in going about it. The Edelman Group has a trust survey that they do annually, and while you could take a look at it, I've given you the web reference there to take a peek at it. There's some interesting observations in the entire thing, but just one of the slides that I wanted to show was that influence and authority are changing a bit. In other words, we used to look at specialists and people of authority who had a deep dive knowledge in certain topics as really the resources that we should go to in making our own decisions. Actually, with regard to what I will call the distributed set of information, think blockchain, think Bitcoin, those sorts of things, think websites that do deep dive into things. They're actually having a greater impact on how we're making decisions, who we choose to trust and why. And in fact, one of the references in the back is a book by Rachel Botsman. Who You Can Trust is the name of her book. And she is talking about a shift from really 3 evolutions of trust in our society. One of them was what I'll call local trust in individuals. You met people. You looked them in the eyes. You decided whether or not you could trust them. You lived in their community, so you watched their actions and could compare their actions to what they said their values were and make sure it was okay. We evolved from that into institutional trust. Think major financial institutions. Think corporate brands. You trusted the brand because they were providers of a reliable product. Now we're moving to a distributed evolution of trust, and that is algorithms, that is high tech. There are places where you can go to search information and backgrounds on people. There is a website called Truly that if you have a person's name, address, you can search all kinds of Facebook, Google, internet-based research to decide whether or not you want to trust them or not. So there are a lot of resources, and we're moving into that evolution, which will presumably, according to Rachel Botsman, change how we decide who to trust and for what. So this is just a general trend, and I wanted to plant the seed for that. Another interesting point about the Edelman Trust Barometer is that we have seen basically a rise in trust in the financial services industry by the general population. A couple of differences, informed public and general population. There is a little bit of a difference there based on how many people really do deep dive in terms of news reports, knowledge, investment industry, and so forth. But it's slowed a little bit. And lots of reasons why that might be the case. Perhaps the polarization in the geopolitical environment these days is driving people back a little bit from being so trusting. But in any case, the general trend has been going up as people know about their industry. For the retail state of wealth management, interestingly, as you would expect, discretionary accounts, think robo accounts that you're giving someone the ability to adjust, have increased a bit over the last few years. In average fees for households are coming down. This is clearly an industry trend, and new accounts are even showing more of a reduction in terms of fee rates. 4 basis points, it's not huge, but they are going down. And this is a study from Price Metrics, which is part of McKinsey & Company. There's clearly some consistent pressure on reduction of fees. And as Peter mentioned in the last discussion, a lot of the acknowledgement of that is going on with the shift to both robo-advising, passive investments in index funds, which obviously carry a little bit of a lower fee associated with the activity that they do. Retail wealth management, another from that McKinsey survey. This is assets under management by generations. So the 4 generations are the greatest generation, think World War II and earlier, baby boomers, 1946 and later, Generation X and Generation Y. And over the years, you do see in 2014, 15, and 16, 92 and 90% of the assets under management are in assets held by those born before 1966. I'm sorry, that's wrong, 1966, beg your pardon. This is the generational issue in spades coming up, because what's going to happen to all those assets? Obviously, people are living longer, but there are going to be generational transfers of assets. I'll talk about it in a second, but there is also a really interesting read that you ought to take a look at. It is a book by Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott, The 100-Year Life. And one of the things that they have mentioned is that for children born in the United States in the year 2005 and later, they will live to an average life expectancy of 105. 105. Now, when you think about that, and the book does go on to explain a little bit more, there are going to be some shifts in terms of what's going on. When I graduated from high school, it was expected you go to college, you cram that 4 years in, you get your degree, you go into the workforce, you start working, and you build your career. Bang, bang, bang. We're seeing that ease up. Now people are not going directly to college. Maybe they want to go overseas for a bit, develop some perception of different cultures, experience the world a little bit before they launch into their career. That's going to be shifting how the investment industry is focused on helping those people do that, in addition to having to deal with the questions of longevity. And more specifically, if you look at what's going to happen with the generational transfer of those assets, advisors need to be really specifically attuned to dealing with that population. Interestingly also, the CFA Society of Los Angeles has undertaken a newer initiative to develop some programs to help advisors focus more on issues with elderly clients from the standpoint of scams that are attempted on elderly clients. The numbers and the proportions of that have really grown. We're seeing a lot of communities, in fact, build commissions and agencies that will help their local communities deal with issues and protect clients in that regard. We're going to be doing some more programs in that regard going forward. There's a specialty firm that I'm familiar with that started in New York. They also have an office in Pasadena. And this guy is a specialist in terms of holistic work with senior clients, those that potentially would eventually have some degradation in their mental capacities due to dementia or just aging. And I had lunch with the guy and I said, talk to me about, in proportion of the clients that you historically have worked with over your career in this business, which is a long time, what proportion of your clients have been hit either with family or external scams or attempted scams? And he said a third. A third. So it is going to become, particularly in terms of the potential aging of our population, a more significant issue to have to deal with, that we should pay attention to and be prepared for. Next slide, there's quite a bit here. I'm just going to make a few comments about these disruptive trends. This was produced by Deloitte Development LLC, and again, I've given you the website if you wanted to take a deeper dive and look at some of the issues. But I'll go through all 10 of them and then focus on 4 that I've highlighted in red here. One is new generation thinks differently, and I mentioned, I will mention in a minute, but there is a book, Unlocking Generational Codes by Anna Leota, that is really a significant read. People speak differently, communicate differently. Priorities are different based on generations, and this book helps equip us, I think, with better thinking and more adaptive skills to be working with intergenerational issues. Robo-advising, that's clearly coming, and interestingly, I went to, CFA has a private wealth institute or group that does programs based on private wealth and focusing on that. And we had a program last year in which we had a debate. There was a person who was specialized in the algorithmic trading and robo-advising, and there was a guy who was a private wealth guy from the UK, and the first guy's charge was in asking the question, as this was, I don't know, 80 to 100 private wealth advisors that were CFAs. Do you think that the robo-advising by technology platform is going to be disruptive? And the first guy was, yes, it's going to be disruptive, and this is why. And the second guy said, this is going to be transformative. And he mentioned why he thought that it was going to be a healthy sort of challenge in a lot of ways for human advising. And at the beginning of this particular session, they did a poll of all these wealth advisors that typically had very significant books of business that they did. And the proportion, the majority said it's going to be disruptive. Robo-advising is going to be disruptive. So we went through the entire course of the program, the discussion, and the points back and forth, what would be good about it, what wouldn't be good about it, and how can we use it to the advantage of private wealth advisors and our clients? Can it be a generational tool that we can engage to help more active communication with clients and so forth? And at the end, after the discussion back and forth and the arm wrestling about robo-advising, they did the poll again. Do you think it's going to be transformative or disruptive? And the greater proportion said transformative. Advisors are embracing technology. Part of the problem is how do you do it most efficiently and how do you adapt it exactly to the client that you're working with at the time? So that's going to be a big issue. Big data, advanced analytics, that was part of what I talked about before. How do we use that more effectively in engaging with clients? Are there automatic rebalancing mechanisms we can engage? Investors value holistic advice on how to achieve multiple, often conflicting goals, a range of investment and funding strategies. There's a lot of pressure from all of the institutions for private wealth to be more human in your approach, more empathetic to your clients, and in terms of talking about values more than specific performance results, to be sure that when you design the strategies that Peter was talking about in terms of timelines and so forth, they really reflect what needs to happen over what range of time. Retail investors are demanding access to asset clients and strategies in the same way as high net worth. This is sort of the compression aspect of fee reductions and so forth. A lot of pressure in the industry to be adaptive to that. Longevity concerns. I just mentioned that new book, Indicating Longer Longevity. I think that one of the most significant issues faced by the industry today is that people do have greater longevity, and a significant proportion of the people in the United States don't save enough money. They just don't. And that will be a huge issue that's going to bite us if we don't do something. Advisors are aging and leaving the industry faster than firms are replacing them. Wealth is about to change hands. And the other thing that is a big issue, we'll talk about in one sec, is the number of people. What is the statistic supporting that? We'll look at it in a second. Macro environment, geopolitics are a huge volatility factor today. I'm sure everybody's concerned about it, but I can't tell you the number of conversations I have with clients that are absolutely on the edge of needing to take action, and they're driven by what they're hearing in the news and looking in the paper in terms of that kind of stuff, as opposed to being a little bit more rational in their approach, but that's certainly a big issue. Regulatory burdens. Obviously, the SEC and the banking regulation system are trying to do their best to protect the individual investors, but I got to tell you, the screws on the compliance for firms have really been turned up. And in fact, I was talking with Fred, who says that it's even difficult sometimes to get people to talk from firms. And that's because the firms are saying, don't talk. We don't want to expose ourselves to any liability in case you misrepresent something insignificant in some way, but somebody will file a complaint against the firm. So there's a lot of shutdown in terms of ordinary dialogue that you would not expect to be the case, but is actually happening. In my own case, I had, in my own compliance department, I have a client that I'm working with who has 12 accounts for different pools that they're managing with me. And this particular client has a retirement fund that I manage the overall portfolio and the overall asset allocation for the family according to an asset allocation model that I believe is entirely appropriate. My firm's compliance department called me and they said, this account we're looking at, and we don't think the assets that are in this account exactly map to the risk profile that you have assigned it to. And I said, well, that's because the account is part of a family combination, and I'm using the overall allocation that maps to what their strategy is over time. And these are retirement funds. The timing for the distribution of those is going to happen later in life, so I'm investing those more aggressively. Overall, they got a nice balanced portfolio. Those are at the top end of the aggressive scale. And my compliance department says, I'm sorry, you're going to have to change the risk profile. Each account now has to have a risk profile because FINRA is requiring that of us. So I'm thinking to myself, come on, can't we use some common sense here? So a lot of those things are coming up. And part of the difficulty for the firms is now they're having to spend a ton of time and effort on compliance, and we have training things in the firm that take time away from our ability to give to clients that are beyond belief. So I'm on a rant, I'm sorry, but those things ruffle my feathers a bit. New business models are emerging, and we are seeing a trend towards more automatic rebalancing and those kinds of things. Disruptive trends. I mentioned combining robo and human advice in terms of the discussion that was going to be the right answer. The question for advisors and their adaptability is, how do we communicate more efficiently with clients? How can we design those programs that allow clients to do electronic signing? And we now have the ability to do text with clients, which was prohibited before. We now have the ability to do more online application trading. You can now take pictures of checks to deposit in your account. You don't manually need to send those in anywhere. All those things, I think, are resulting in greater efficiencies that will help us do better. Shifting to holistic goals-based advice that measure performance on achieving goals versus comparison against rigid benchmark. Now, there is value in looking at how your performance is relative to a reasonable benchmark, but the fundamental, more important value is it doing what it needs to in terms of the achievement of your overall goals? The statistic I wanted to mention is that 43% of U.S. advisors over age 55, 1/3 of which will be retiring in the next 10 years. With all of the, and I talk to a lot of these people all the time in my own firm that are on the edge, and compliance is driving them crazy. They've been in the business a long time. It's, I'm expecting potentially that's even a greater issue than it is. And the new advisors that need to be recruited and trained is a growing number. So one of the specific implications that comes out of that to me that I would suggest you put in the back of your mind is if you have an advisor and or a team, that you ask the question about succession planning, because obviously, if they decide to get out of the business, could be a transition. What kind of services? Who's going to step into their role to do what you've become accustomed to them doing? And the resource I mentioned, this is Unlocking Generational Codes by Anna Liotta. What makes the generations tick and what ticks them off. In terms of leadership, this will be a clear item, and in terms of how to discuss generational issues, I think it's important. And obviously the competitive patents. One of the things that I've observed, it's my opinion, it's supported in a couple of surveys I've read, but independent RIAs, because of the fact that the smaller boutique firms, even though they may have a national support infrastructure, allow more flexibility in how they work with their clients. So I'm seeing a kind of a degradation and a sort of a gaining of investment advisors at the expense of wirehouses. They'll still be around. I'm not saying wirehouses are going away, obviously, but there seems to be a little bit more flexibility with the independent shops than the otherwise would. The next study I'm going to talk about is called a FI study, and this was done by the CFA Institute and State Street Center for Applied Research. I've given you the website link down there. And they did a study that assessed motivations of people who were in the investment advising business. And the point of assessing the motivations was to see how big a driver were motivations in terms of what people actually did. And the intent of the overall study, based on its result, is we need to move from performance-driven to purpose-driven in terms of the way that we support our advisors. And so the CFA Institute and a number of the other organizations, including the Investment and Wealth Institute, in which I am the ethics editor for their magazine, are in fact focusing on how to support their advisors to do that more effectively. They want to enhance the process to long-term goal focus in terms of the fiduciary efforts, put client interests first pretty clearly, and that's been the goal of what they're wanting to really focus on for the advisors. In addition to the oversight of bad actors in the business, which is one of the things that both organizations do to encourage complaints to be vetted and people removed who shouldn't be in the business for whatever reason. The findings of this study are sort of interesting. A 1-point increase in the PHI score, and this, I've forgotten the total number of advisors that were assessed, or firm leaders, but there were several thousands. A 1-point increase in PHI score meant a 28% greater odds of excellent long-term organizational performance. Numbers, that is, greater growth in business, greater wallet share per client, greater client satisfaction in terms of the reports that were there. 55% greater odds of client satisfaction and 57% greater odds of employee engagement, meaning the employees and their performance reports and their ability to be managed were certainly higher. These were the scores from their findings. The only thing that jumps out at me, and in looking at this I think it's kind of interesting, is the high PHI, unusually low. You would think that people in the business had a greater motivation to help people, but perhaps not. Moderate, about 30%. So a little less than half in terms of what we would want the industry to be. And in my opinion, that sort of says we need to focus on ensuring that the people who are moving into this business are doing it for the right reasons. It also would suggest that perhaps having a conversation with your advisor or a prospective advisor might want to focus on what they value in terms of what's driving them into the business. And there were an inordinately low PHI score and no PHI score. One of the other things that came out of the study that I didn't cite here, though, was that the perception for a number of the test takers were that their firm leadership was not quite as high on the PHI score as they wanted it to be. Leaders and future firms need to, in our opinion then, increase in several areas. Purpose, align firm purpose and values with clients. It's going to be an important issue. Habits, how do you in fact incorporate the purpose of helping people into specific practice actions that you take, and incentives, particularly redesign incentives to improve cognitive and emotional functions, specifically avoid short-term financial incentives as a reward to do things well. And this also would get at, I think, the issue with regard to conflicts of interest. Managing conflicts of interest is an important issue for us to address in the industry. There is an interesting read that I will cite in a minute, but so many people have said you need to simply disclose a conflict of interest. And by that disclosure, you're essentially off the hook. In fact, there's been a lot of study in that regard that says simple disclosure is not sufficient to resolve a conflict of interest. Because you assume once you've disclosed it, you know about it, then I can make my decision and do whatever I want to do because I've told you that there is a potential conflict of interest. Actually managing conflicts of interest is something different. And the firms, in my opinion, need to manage conflicts of interest much more efficiently than they do today. There was another study coming out of the study that said a proportion of investment professionals would be pleased to have performance bonus on a 2 to 5 year basis versus an annual bonus. So firms are going to be looking at these things that, in my opinion, from an individual investor standpoint, are more productive in terms of helping the industry get on a more substantial scale. There was another piece that came out from Focus Consulting Group in Chicago. Jim Ware is the guy that runs this particular operation, and he has a piece called Money, Meaning, and Mindsets that you can simply look up, and I do cite it on the next slide. There is a reference to it in point. But he starts with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and so forth, and the lowest hierarchy is, primitive years, do what you want to do, power and control are the issues, and it's hard to see. Security and safety and survival are the important, and the whole evolution of society is going up. And the second member is guardian, connection, belonging, loyalty. Life has meaning and purpose with predetermined outcomes. The orange is more success, winning, competing, and at least in Jim Ware's perception, this is where the industry is currently, basically orange. Search for success, do what we need to do, drive a hard bargain, compete, and your own self-interest is really the governing factor. Jim is suggesting that the leaders of our business need to move into the green mode. Peace within, harmony in community, trust and respect, collaboration, communication. So a number of the initiatives coming out of the CFA Institute and the other national organizations are focusing on ways to shift our toolkit to include those as the way that we work with clients more significantly. I just mentioned that orange, and we should move to green. High emotional quotients, emotional sensitivity, empathy for clients, and that sort of thing, as opposed to we're going to hit these goals, I'm making X amount of dollars in addition to your benchmarks. We may have to look more distinctly, and I'll talk about this in a few seconds when we're into talking about how you value advisors. Ware has an interesting description of a term that he's calling household alpha. Household alpha is, how about your estate plan and your long-range tax flow forecast? And am I doing some things as your advisor that actually are saving you estate tax costs potentially, or are looking at mapping your assets with a mix that handles more successful planning for your future generation? There's true value in that. How is it valued? It's not really today, but generating different ways to evaluate advisor performance, including something that would be on the term of household alpha, would be important. Are there risks that you are taking in terms of your insurance policies that aren't particularly efficient for you? Are there ways that we can review your insurance to come up with a more efficient way of doing that? Some advisors do that. It's beyond the scope of specific investment returns, but it is a service that some advisors provide that would be valuable to certain clients. How do we measure trust? How do you know whether you can trust your advisor? How important is it? How would you measure your trust? Gut feel? Is there other ways we can do that? It's probably some skill set that advisors need to spend more time learning in terms of how it is that they get better at it. Perhaps we should look at restructuring fees such that your advisor has skin in the game. If performance is strong, maybe your advisor should get kind of a conceptual fee bonus for that. If it's weak, he participates by reducing, he or she, by reducing fees. So tweak fees to adapt to the performance. Firms with leaders in green or yellow stages are better positioned, perhaps, for the future in hiring the right advisors that are adaptable. So that's another thing that came out of that particular study. One of the things that is clear in terms of all these perceptive studies that is emerging, and the industry spending a lot of time in it, is the difference between fiduciary and suitability. And I just put this up as a reminder. The suitability standard is, in fact, lower. Brokers, trading, people who are compensated on a transaction basis, and the specific choice of investments that they put on the menu of choices for their clients are labeled as suitable, meaning it's reasonable to think that this is a good investment for you. But fiduciary standards is a higher standard, and it says that an advisor, in presenting investment choices to their client, needs to be doing so on the basis of the best interests of the client. In other words, the advisor says, I know you well enough to say that this investment meets a higher standard. Interestingly, both the CFA Institute and a number of the organizations are advocating for regulations that make the fiduciary standard the standard for anybody in the private wealth advice business these days. And they're saying that anybody that is not labeled an advisor, brokers, for example, or perhaps annuity salespeople, have to be labeled as salespeople. So that there's kind of a clear line of distinction between what is the fiduciary standard and what is not. As well, you'll see a lot of the firms and the institutions focusing on putting investors first. And in fact, the CFA Institute has developed a website and resources with a statement of investor rights. And all of the training for private wealth professionals now is focused on these kinds of activities. Honesty, independent and objective advice, priority of financial interests, fair treatment, disclosure of conflicts, and as I mentioned, the book that is an interesting read, I didn't put this, is The Failure of Mandated Disclosures, but it's really interesting to read in terms of how much mandated disclosures really don't do the job. And there's the Investment Wealth Institute, as an example, now has developed a preamble to the code and standards, and the same is true of the CFA Institute. And the code and standards that people who have those designations, CFA and the Certified Investment Management Analyst, CIMA, and the C8, Chartered Financial, the Private Wealth Advisor, Certified Private Wealth Advisor designations, all sign a code that it has a preamble that says not only is it right that you disclose, but you have to manage your conflicts of interest. So our actual code and standards is requiring that conflicts of interest be managed, not just simply disclosed. So I'm going to jump into some issues that I think are interesting for people to keep in mind. And I will be honest with you, I think the industry does an absolutely lousy job of distinguishing what you're paying for and who you're paying it to. This was a study done by Cerulli some time ago, but it still, I think, has implications today. It was 2010, but it grouped practices into 4 major categories. A money manager, really you could think of a broker, somebody that focused on investments alone. an investment planner, asset management services, but may offer some other services, retirement plans or education funding. A financial planner, which does complete a financial plan, has full range of services, and a wealth manager. Think of a wealth manager as a family chief investment officer, CIO as we would call it, and they handle everything from bill pay to trip planning to generational transfers to insurance reviews to income taxes and all that kind of stuff. And money manager has less service, and wealth advisors obviously have more. But in reality, when you're looking at the fees that you're paying, how often do you get some distinction with what these services provide and how to hold the value for them? It's part of the, if you're paying percentage of assets and you're getting a lot of additional services for that content, there is some value that's being generated from those fees that isn't necessarily identified if you're just saying, all I want is low-cost fees, period. And how much are you going to charge me to do these additional things? You could say we should change the industry to make it fee-only planning. And there are a lot of firms that do that. To the extent that I'm managing money, I'm just going to charge you that fee. But if you want these additional extra services, let's come up with an hourly-based rate or a project-based rate or something like that. We may see that happen. It would be a way to evaluate that. But I'm just saying in general, if you're paying fees and you're getting these additional services, there ought to be some way that you value those. This was also a survey that says how many, by practice type, what sort of services are rendered. And so obviously you see these various type groups and the proportions that they spend in terms of the activity. Investment planner and financial planner or wealth managers all obviously did retirement income planning and projections. Due diligence, a lot higher on that regard. Estate and insurance, obviously higher to the right you go. And then specialty projects were another piece of the proportion of how many firms were doing that in terms of their practice models. And I guess I like to summarize the idea in sort of a simple way of thinking about it. If you think about the value to you of how it applies to your situation in terms of the tailoring of value, the human advisor, in terms of the automated system and the robo-advising, standardized reporting, contact via mass emails, automated communication, index and passives, they don't add a lot of value, but they are, in fact, a way to keep you engaged. The human value comes when you incorporate the human touch. Discovery of values, belief principles, customized reporting, estate and income tax support, insurance, family dynamics, retirement planning. An example for that is I have a client who is passing some generational wealth, client of about $20 million, passing $3 million, and is buying a home for each of his 3 children. We have done an extensive amount of research on how to fund that, whether or not he should simply gift it to them or have them sign notes back, how to handle the transfer based on the profiling of each of the 3 kids in terms of the psychology of whether they can handle it or not. Their circumstances are very different. These days, if you really want to be engaged, you almost have to have a degree in psychology to do this well. But certainly, in his opinion, in our discussions with him, that has been very valuable. Simply to have the conversations and to catalyze the discussion between the client and his wife in resolving that was helpful, because they may or may not have done it on their own, and at least it provided a platform for them to have those discussions. There's a couple of things that you can take a look at in terms of resources. And this is really an excellent resource to take a peek at. Charlotte Baer has been in the industry a long time, and she wrote a book, Wealth Management Unwrapped. And in looking at hiring an advisor, assessing yourself for your level of knowledge and the need for control are pretty important topics. And this is a self-exam, and you go through, answer all these questions, and score yourself on that, and then you put that into a chart here and see where you place. And this is interesting. People like us, caution, capable, overconfident, do-it-yourselfer, vulnerable, irresponsible, naive, hopeful, delusional. If you're out at the extremes, there's going to be difficulty in reaching a reasonable working agreement with an advisor. And in fact, in the middle is a probably most successful zone in which to score. But the issue is low need for control, high need for control, sophistication levels, and so forth. That's the area of most productive engagement, I would say. If your scores are in there, it's more likely. Otherwise, you're probably going to have some issues with regard to anybody that you would choose to hire. Or you would have to have some specialty services, I would think, in terms of wanting to be sure that you take more time to get things done. The other helpful thing is to take a minute to think what is most valuable to you in terms of practice provided and so forth. People, philosophy, process, performance, and fees. Who they are, what they believe, how decisions are made, how they've done, and what they charge. What they believe is the FI study coming into play and saying that matters, and so forth. One of the interesting things that comes out of this to me that is an important question, and we'll go through a few questions in a minute that I provided for sort of a matrix if you're looking to hire somebody, is how do you use this tool? In other words, if you're screening an advisor and saying what's important about all this too, one important question would be, in terms of philosophy, a huge question, are there classifications of potential clients that you don't consider working with, and why? That is a question that is rarely asked, but I think it's hugely important. And it shapes the ability of an advisor to mesh with the clients properly. In my years of practicing as a CPA years ago, as an example, I worked a lot with doctors in my practice at one point. I'm no longer practicing